Welcome to my presentation, Looping Effects and the Stability of Social Practices. My name is Bernd Prien. I'm affiliated with the University of Münster in Germany. My presentation is located in the theoretical context of Sally Haslanger's practice theory. According to Haslanger, societies are shaped by social practices which in turn are organized into more complex social structures. The question about practices I want to address today concerns their stability. According to Haslanger, this stability is accounted for by looping effects. I will present Haslanger's account, raise an objection, and outline a way to avoid it. Let me start by introducing Haslanger's notion of a practice. Practices, according to Haslanger, are constituted by a resource and a schema. Practices coordinate us with respect to the use and treatment of a resource. Resources can be of very different kinds. They can be human beings, other animals, or material objects, or spaces, or whatever. Anything that is or can be of value, according to Haslanger. A schema is the socially accepted way of conceiving of a resource, of the socially accepted way of dealing with this resource, of using this resource, treating this resource, feeling about this resource, and so forth. The examples of practices that Haslanger is most interested in are racism and sexism, both of which are social practices on her account. In this case, the resources are human beings of a certain kind, and the resources are the social roles that men, women, or members of racialized groups are assigned and which also shape their identities. Another example would be the streets in cities. Here the resource is the space between the buildings, and the schema says how these spaces are to be used. So, for example, the schema could be that these spaces are to be used by driving in cars. So now I forgot to show you the rest of my slides, so here it is. Okay, let's continue. The question I want to ask is, as I said, about the stability of social practices. Namely, the fact is that practices are rather persistent over long periods of time, but if they are constituted by what is collectively accepted in a society, one might ask why they are not variable and fleeting, like what is fashionable to wear. That's in 1 year this is fashionable, and in the next year another thing is fashionable to wear. So why are practices not like that? Why are they rather persistent and stable? This is something that demands explanation. Haslanger's answer is that the stability of practices is explained by what she calls looping effects between the schemata and the resources. There are two causal connections that constitute these loops. First, there is a causal connection going from the schema to the resource. So the fact that there is a collectively accepted schema has an effect on the resource insofar as we shape the resource according to the schema. And second, there's also a causal connection going back from the resource to the schema. This is that we observe the resource and find that it conforms to our schema, which then reinforces the schema. So let us consider an example: gender practices. According to our schemata, men and women have typical character traits. Now, society shapes men and women according to the schemata, insofar as they are brought up and socialized according to them. So this is the causal connection going from the schema to the resource. So the fact that we have the schema about men and women affects the character traits they in fact have. And then there's a second causal connection going the other way, which is that the schemata are reinforced by observation, because if we look at actual cases of men and women, we observe that they have certain typical character traits. And this then reinforces our schemata. So there's this loop between the schema and the resource, the schema affecting the resource, and the resource in turn affecting the schema, so that they strengthen each other. And again, the example of the streets, which I will use in this presentation. Here, our schema says that the resource, the spaces between the building, that they are for driving in cars. And therefore, the streets are built such to facilitate driving in cars while ruling out other possible uses. And then the other way around, we observe the streets and find that they are best used for driving in cars, and this reinforces our schema. So because there are these two causal connections between schemata and resources, Haslanger says that practices are not just in our heads in the form of schemata, but that they are also materialized. So the matter that is shaped according to our schema is part of the practice. Now, in my presentation, I want to take a closer look at the second causal connection that I have sketched, namely that schemata are reinforced by observations of resources. I will first raise doubts about this connection really exists, and then propose a modified connection. So in my view, there are in fact looping effects, but they're not quite as simple as Haslanger makes out. Haslanger's claim that observation leads to the reinforcement of communally shared schemata is subject to a number of problems. One of them is that if the schemata are to guide our use and treatment of resources, they have to have prescriptive elements. So not just descriptive elements, but also prescriptive elements. And the question would be how they could be reinforced by observation. And secondly, the descriptive elements of our schemata are in many cases only indirectly observable. So there is room for variation between what you observe, because what you observe, what you indirectly observe, depends on all kinds of collateral commitments that you might have or might not have. So, and this, I think, creates the problem that I think is rather simple and obvious, namely that there are ambiguous cases of resources that can be viewed or observed in different ways. So even if we shape the resources in light of our schemata, there will still be a lot of cases that are not totally clear, that are ambiguous, such that different people might view them in different ways. So let us again take the street example. The resource in this case is the space between the buildings, and some will perceive these spaces as places to drive. Maybe not very good ones, but still they are places to drive. While others might perceive them as places for social interaction, where you can meet people, talk to people, that kind of stuff. So even if we assume that a resource has been shaped in the light of our schema, there will still be many cases that are not quite clear and which can be perceived in different ways. So the general idea here is that we have, as it were, collectively accepted preconceptions of the resources, but then if you actually look at the cases, if you actually look how things are, you might find that they do not at all or do not unambiguously conform to our schemata. In spite of this difficulty, so actually observation might just as well be said to be a source of instability for our schemata, as it may be said to be a source of reinforcement for our schemata, as Hasslinger says. So it's it can just as well destabilize things as it can stabilize things. So in spite of this difficulty, I think that looking effects between resources and schemata do in fact play an important role in stabilizing practices. And I will now present a modified account of how the resources reinforce the schemata. And this account involves the following three elements. Hey, shit. The first element is this. Hasslinger assumes that first-hand observation is the main source of reinforcement. But it seems much more plausible to assume that the testimony of others plays an important role here too. Sometimes agents simply have no first-hand experience of a resource, and then they're wholly dependent on what others tell them about this resource with regard to the schema they accept. But even for agents who have experiential access themselves, the testimony of others will contribute to shape their view, because our schemata are simply something that is subject to debate. So a schema is a collectively shared way of conceiving of something, and there's bound to be public debate about it. And there, of course, not just the observation that members of the society themselves make, but also what others say and argue about this resource plays an important role. The second element is that what people observe depends on their social position. So the thought here is that In the case of material objects as resources, what you observe are properties of these objects, because and in virtue of these properties, this object lends itself to be used in a certain way. And now what you observe, which properties you pay attention to, depends on your social position. Whether an agent perceives a resource in one way or another depends on her interest, her options and opportunities for actions, her prior experience, and so forth. Thus, people who have cars, for instance, tend to perceive the spaces as between buildings as places to drive, whereas others who live nearby and don't have cars are more likely to perceive them as places for face-to-face social interaction. Now, furthermore, the interests, the options and opportunities for action depend to a considerable extent on people's social position. So we can assume that different views of the resource and different social positions are, at least to some extent, correlated. The third element is what Miranda Fricker has called epistemic injustice. She distinguishes between credibility deficit, which is that some people, those who suffer from credibility deficit, that is, their word is given less credit than would be due, while others enjoy credibility excess. Their assertions are given more credit than is warranted by what they could say in support of them, by their expertise, and so forth. Furthermore, there is what Fricker calls hermeneutic injustices. So some people have more hermeneutic power than others. So and that is the power to shape the hermeneutical resources of the society, which in Haslanger's term would be the power to shape our schemata. Fricker is more interested in credibility deficit than she is in credibility excess, and she's also more interested in the phenomenon that some social groups lack hermeneutic power, but for my purposes, the opposite phenomena will be more important. So credibility access, that some people's word is given more weight than would be due, and that some people have the power, more power than others, to shape the schemata or hermeneutical resources. Moreover, it will be important that, as Fricker points out, these injustices or inequalities are often systematic. So it depends on the social position of the speakers, whether they suffer from credibility deficit or have credibility access, and how much hermeneutic power they have. So the problem was that there are ambiguous instances of a resource, and they can be perceived in different ways, and that this is a source of instability for our practices. My solution is that, well, we string these three elements together, and then we can counter the threat of instability. The first thing to note is that the differences in the view of the resource, they do not differ chaotically, as it were, but rather are dependent on the social position. So what view of a resource one has, it depends on the social group one belongs to. And ambiguous cases that can be viewed differently by different groups, the view of the epistemically powerful group will be reinforced, in which of their epistemic power they can, as it were, override the divergent observations of the less powerful group. In this way, the divergent observations, which would challenge the schema, do not destabilize the schema. So let us return to the example of a street. So members of the economically privileged group have cars and consequently view the spaces between buildings as something to be used for driving in cars. Members of a group that lives nearby those spaces and is economically less powerful, on the other hand, tend to view these spaces as places for face-to-face social interaction. However, since the economically privileged group is also epistemically privileged, their view determines the collectively accepted schemata in the society. So I have raised doubts about Haslanger's causal connection going from the resource to the schema, and I have developed a more complex view of this connection. So there is this connection, but it's more complex than Haslanger says. According to this more complex view, the causal chain from the resource to the collectively shared schema runs as follows. The resources impinge on the experiences of members of all social groups, though members of different groups will have different experiences. In the case of powerless social groups, the causal chain ends here. In the case of powerful social groups, it continues testimonially via their hermeneutic and epistemic power to the other agents and gets collectively accepted. Thank you for your attention.